What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another discography ranking for you guys. Since it's been over a couple of months since we did the Dream Theater ranking, I decided that here for Halloween, happy Halloween everybody, as everybody's watching this on Halloween, and I am here to talk about all 7 studio full-lengths from Danish classic metal titans Mercyful Fate. So yeah, this is a discography that I was very curious about, considering, I'm a pretty big fan of King Diamond as a whole. I mean, I think he's one of the best vocalists in metal history. I mean, easily the most unique metal vocalist in metal history with his crazy high falsetto. And yeah, this one was very interesting to go through. I was already familiar with a few of these albums, but not the entire catalog. So yeah, this was a cool little trip through the evil world of metal. As far as how I got introduced to Mercyful Fate, it was, funny enough, Metallica, because they did the Garage Inc. album back in the late 90s, and they did a medley of Mercyful Fate songs called Mercyful Fate, and it was one of the best unique covers I've ever heard in my life. And of course, I come to learn that Mercyful Fate was one of the biggest influences on bands like Metallica and Megadeth, and a lot of thrash and classic heavy metal bands really latch on to what Mercyful Fate did. So yeah, as far as like where I got into him, this was like the late 2000s, early 2010s, when I first heard stuff like Melissa and Don't Break the Oath and other songs here and there, but never really gave the entire catalog a shot until doing this ranking. And needless to say, I loved all these albums. So yeah, there are no bad albums at all in this catalog. So ranking this, apart from the top 2, it was kind of difficult because it can really change on a whim depending on what I'm in the mood for. But without further ado, let's get into the history of Mercyful Fate. So Mercyful Fate formed in 1981 out of Copenhagen, Denmark, and it was formed out of the ashes of another band called Brats. And of course they had a bunch of different members early on, but I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just going to talk about the original classic lineup. Consisted of Kim Ruz on drums, Timmy Hansen on bass, both Michael Diener and Hank Sherman on guitars, and Kim Peterson, a.k.a. King Diamond, on vocals. And, well, this was the lineup that really solidified the band early on, and they did a couple of pretty big demos that have gone on to become legendary in the world of metal, and in 1983 they get signed to Roadrunner Records. Back, again, when you can trust Roadrunner back in the day, not so much now. But they would enter the studio in 1983 to work on their debut album. They would get Henrik Lund to come in to do the production on this album, and released October 30th, 1983, we get their debut album, Melissa. So this was really where it got to be a little difficult to rank the top 2, because my top 2 are really like the definitive Mercyful Fate albums, so it was like I almost thought about doing it as a 1A, 1B. This ended up as my number 2. I absolutely love this album. I mean, some of the band's most well-known songs are on here, especially the opening track, Evil. Still their most famous song, and of course it's a classic metal blitz, with great shredding lead sections. And of course, Michael and Hank, they are just, I would argue, the most underrated guitar duo in the history of metal. Like, those guys write excellent riffs, excellent solos, and this song is definitely a great showcase of their talents. But this song also definitely has a lot of influence to like speed metal as well, since it was more of a speed metal song. Curse of the Pharaohs, another classic song off of this album. Lots of nods to Judas Priest in the riff writing department. Into the Coven, tasty acoustic guitars and melodies, and some more of those Judas Priest inspired riffs. Satan's Fall, which was like their first big epic, I guess you could call it, because it was over 10 minutes. And it's one of their most progressive songs in their entire career. It's got lots of great gallops. It's very moody. There's even some atonal riffs that show up here, which was not something done a whole lot back in the early 80s. And also some like awesome swings going on. And then even the closing track, the title track, Melissa, another rather proggy song, but it's mostly melodic and it's dark. And of course, King Diamond getting to showcase his entire vocal range on that song. And just as a little note for you guys watching, Dan Swano did a cover of this song in the 90s, and while I do like the original, I think I like Swano's cover a little bit more because he was able to showcase more vocal diversity in his cover of this song. But regardless, top to bottom, no bad song. Every single song is a classic, although it does end up as my number 2. So the band keeps trudging along, doing little shows here and there, and writing and recording new stuff. So they would go back to the studio in 1984 to work on their second album. Once again, Henrik Lund coming back as the producer, and released September 7th, 1984. Once again on Roadrunner Records, we get the follow-up, Don't Break the Oath. Yeah, going into this ranking, this was my clear-cut number 1, and still is my clear-cut number 1. I have been a fan of this album for over 10 years. I mean, this was the first big Mercyful Fate album I really got into in high school. I mean, this album basically takes everything that they did on Melissa, but made it bigger, more epic, and dare I say, heavier. Also, I love the production on this album a little bit more than Melissa, just because of how much bigger the band sounded on here. And this is where I think a lot of great 80s metal kind of gets its influence from, is an album like this. And I would say musically, little less Judas Priest influence and more Iron Maiden influence kind of comes in. But the opening track, A Dangerous Meeting, one of my favorite Mercyful Fate songs. It's heavy, and there's even like a really cool like doomy breakdown at the very end with bells going off. Nightmare, man, you want to talk about a lot of transitions and off-time signatures going on. Like, that's another one of their more proggy tracks. And it's got tasty melody and wonderfully done keyboards on that song. Desecration of Souls, that's a groovy, chuggy, classic metal song right there, right off the rip. Then the big epic of the album, The Oath. Arguably the most evil-sounding Mercyful Fate song, at least back in their early days. But it's dark, there's a lot of great swings, and it's just a flat-out epic song, and it's another one of those that kind of feels like it could be a proto-progressive metal song. And then the closing track, which this was actually the first song, or one of the first songs I ever heard from the band, Come to the Sabbath. Great vocals, awesome riffs, and just some really cool, like, kind of almost, dare I say, jazzy swings kind of come in there, like a little bit of that Black Sabbath influence, which, given the title, you would think it's a bit of a Black Sabbath nod, but it's still, for the most part, kind of speed metal, because it's got some, like, galloping D beats going on. But yeah, this album was just massive, and I can certainly see why a lot of classic metal bands would be inspired by this, so Don't Break the Oath, my number 1. However, the success wouldn't last, as in 1985, there became some tension between the band and mainly Hank Sherman. Hank was one to go into a more mainstream style, and as he was getting tired of the satanic lyrical content, while King, Michael, and Timmy, they wanted to keep doing what they were doing for the first 2 albums, but Hank grew disinterested in what they were doing, so they broke up in 1985, as Hank would go on to form a band called Fate, which was a more hard rock, glam metal kind of band, like kind of geared towards what Hank wanted Mercyful Fate to become. But meanwhile, King Diamond, Michael Diener, and Timmy Hansen would end up forming the King Diamond solo band along with Andy LaRocque and Mickey D, and the rest is history with that. So basically throughout the rest of the 80s and into the 90s, all that was really coming out was King Diamond solo band stuff, which I won't talk about in this ranking because that can be a ranking down the road in the future. However, the interest in Mercyful Fate still remained primarily in the underground, with thrash metal bands, death metal bands, and black metal bands kind of being inspired by some of the big, long, epic songs they did. Like, Slayer would take cues from Mercyful Fate on their album Hell Awaits. And then, of course, black metal bands being inspired by the face paint of King Diamond to add that to, like, the black metal imagery. And then death metal bands were interested in the riff complexity of Mercyful Fate and wanted to kind of interject that into an emerging subgenre. So the interest in the band was always there, it's just they were inactive. However, the interest kept on growing and growing and growing so much to the point that in 1993, Mercyful Fate would reunite. I guess Hank would reconcile with the other guys in the band and get Mercyful Fate back on track. However, slight change in lyrical themes for the next several albums. Less about satanic imagery and more towards like the occult and death and horror and literature, kind of in vein of the King Diamond solo band. So kind of a lyrical continuation from that. And the reformed lineup, we would get King, Michael, Hank, and Timmy back together, but they would get a new drummer for this next album. Morten Nielsen would come in to be the drummer for this next album that they would record, and also they would get picked up by Metal Blade Records, and they would pretty much remain on Metal Blade for the rest of the career, even to this day. So for this album, Tim Kimsey would come in to be the producer, and released June 22nd, 1993, their debut on Metal Blade Records, In the Shadows. This is my number 4 album. This was a great return for Mercyful Fate after 9 years of dormancy from album to album, and yeah, interesting time to come back, because, 1993, this was when grunge was really the big thing, and like bands like Mercyful Fate could have been seen as out of fashion or out of touch from the rest of the world, but they didn't care. They wanted to come out swinging, and they absolutely did. As songs on here that really stood out, the opening track, Egypt, that's another one of my favorite Mercyful Fate songs, as it's just filled with galloping D beats and fantastic riffs, and of course, Michael and Hank shredding along together, and it's magical. Always magical. The Bell Witch, this was one of the doomiest songs that Mercyful Fate ever did, as it's heavily Black Sabbath inspired. There's some great swings, but then it does turn into more Iron Maiden gallops, as it just gallops along to just really stick to your head. The Old Oak, some more atonal riffs show up, but it's heavy, it's epic, and another one of those kind of more progressive songs that Mercyful Fate wrote. Shadows, the title track, rather groovy, and it's quite rockin'. Like, it's a rocker, like a flat-out rocker with some really cool, tasty melody. And then Legend of the Headless Rider, probably one of the more diverse songs in their entire discography. Like, it's eerie, it's got groove to it, but it's absolutely wild, it's fast, almost, dare I say, thrash metal fast at times. It's melodic, but it also does get into some more rockin' riffs going on. I mean, it was a really cool return for the band. And then also a fun fact, one song that was actually from a demo called Return of the Vampire, they did a re-recording of this song with guest appearance of Lars Ulrich of Metallica doing the drums, in which he did a solid job. Granted, when it came to the rest of the songs, Morten was better, I will admit. But still, it was a really cool song to bring the album to a close. And yeah, for their debut on Metal Blade, it was a big step for the band. However, the only sad part about it, this would end up being the last album with original bassist Timmy Hansen. So this was kind of the end of an era for Mercyful Fate, as he would bow out shortly after the album came out. But still, my number 4, it's fantastic. So after Timmy Hansen would bow out of the band, they would get actually a couple new members, as Morten Nilsson was only a session drummer for the album. So replacements for drums, you would get, at the time, current King Diamond drummer Snowy Shaw, who's a fucking madman in his own right, as he's been involved with countless bands that I'm not going to touch on in this video. And for bass, we would get Charlie D'Angelo, who's mostly known for becoming the bassist for Arch Enemy by the end of the decade. But Snowy and Charlie would come in to take over drum and bass duties, respectively. And, well, they went right back to work for this next album. They would return to the studio in 1994 and released October 25th, 1994 on Metal Blade Records. We get Time. This is my number 3. I think this was a step up from In the Shadows in terms of songwriting and as well as like the overall heaviness. Like, I would argue this is a heavier album. It's similar to like how, you know, Melissa was like the band that put them, or not the band, the album that put them on the map. Don't Break the Oath was like the bigger version of Melissa. It was like In the Shadows, it was like the big return of Mercyful Fate, and then Time is like the bigger version of In the Shadows. Excuse me. As this album, I think the songwriting, while it's bigger, it does feel a little more stripped down. Like, they kind of decide to strip out some of the big epic moments and just get right down to the nitty-gritty of riffs and solos and just being heavy. The opening single, Nightmare Be Thy Name, was one of the catchiest songs, and also some like really cool legato riffs going on, and also some of my favorite vocals King Diamond ever delivered, not only in the falsetto, but even in his lower register, they sounded really cool. He sounded like an actual ghost. Witch's Dance was another one of the earliest songs I got into, and awesome music video as well. And also what's unique, it's like this song is like the perfect representation of what Mercyful Fate have always been musically. Like, you get some like faster sections, some like slower moments, especially that middle bridge section where it kind of mellows out and it's kind of doomy, and you get King singing while you get some like vocal rounds going, ah! It was super, super cool. And also like King going into borderline death metal vocals when he says, "And the fallen mo must burn." I fucked that up, I'm sorry, but it was a fantastic song. And then you get into the Mad Arab, which is kind of Middle Eastern inspired. Like, the instrumentation is really cool, but lyrically it's about Cthulhu, so they started to get into some H.P. Lovecraft stuff, but it's a groovy track. It's got some atonal melodies. My Demon, probably some of the best guitar harmonies and swings you will ever hear on any Mercyful Fate track. And then Castillo del Mortes, eerie melodies, but also some tastefully done acoustic guitars. And even the title track kind of reminds me of something the band Ghost would do, and you can definitely tell that Ghost love their Mercyful Fate and King Diamond. So that song, I can definitely hear where Tobias Forge gets a little bit of influence from, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, Time, just a bigger album for the band, and it was my number 3. So, not long after Time came out, Snowy Shaw would end up leaving the band, and in his place would be drummer Bjarne T. Holm, and he would pretty much remain the drummer for the rest of the career of Mercyful Fate. So, permanent drummer in 1994 comes along, and we keep trudging along as they would return to the studio in 1996, and this would be the final album produced by Tim Kimsey. And released October 20th, 1996, we get Into the Unknown. This one did drop a little bit. It's my number 5, but it's still another fantastic offering from Mercyful Fate. I mean, the big standout for me on this album would be the song The Uninvited Guest. It's always been a favorite of mine as it's just a great speed metal song. Like, it's galloping D beats and riffs and solos galore, and one of my favorite King Diamond vocal performances. And yeah, it was just a fantastic way to get this album going. The Ghost of Change, very cool because it has a lot of Black Sabbath swagger, but a lot of Judas Priest energy. So it's almost like you took Sabbath and Priest and combined them into one song, and it was fantastic. The title track has some really cool, clean melodies, awesome swing. It almost gets borderline cosmic, and some of the riffs on here, I could definitely probably hear that maybe Mercyful Fate was inspired by a little bit of Megadeth at this point, because there are some Megadeth riffs that kind of pop up here. And then Cthulhu, the Mad Arab Part 2, once again, it feels like a great continuation of Part 1 from Time. That Middle Eastern instrumentation, it's groovy. There's even some proper death roars from King Diamond in his voice, which I thought was really appropriate for the song. Really, the only thing I have against this album, the song Dead Time, while musically it's fun, it's kind of a dumb song, if I'm going to be honest. I thought it was probably the dumbest song they've ever written, but it's not enough to really hurt this album much, as it's still a fantastic album. It's just number 5 because I just like the ones that came before it more. So not long after Into the Unknown was released, Michael Diener, longtime original guitarist, would end up leaving the band, and he would be replaced by Swedish guitar extraordinaire Mike Weed, who I'm primarily familiar with due to his work on Edge of Sanity's Crimson 2 album. Excuse me. That came out in 2003. But he would pretty much remain the guitarist for the rest of the career, apart from some reunion shows years later. But yeah, Mike Weed would come along to play guitar for Mercyful Fate, and they would return to the studio at the end of 1997 into 1998, and this time they would get producer Sterling Weinfeld would come along to be the producer, and released June 9th, 1998, once again on Metal Blade Records, we get Dead Again. Now, unfortunately, in a ranking where every album's awesome and it's only 7, something had to come in last place, and it was this one. But that's not to say it's a bad album. It's still a great album, and it's very different from the majority of the discography. Like this one, the production's a little more raw, but not in a muddy sense. It's actually more raw, and it's more gritty than anything else. Like, the production kind of feels closer to the 80s era of Mercyful Fate, and then the songwriting gets more complex, and this is the most progressive album they have ever done, so you could argue this is a prog metal album to some degree, as you get some long songs on here, but starting things off with Torture 1629, proggy time signature changes and lots of riff changes going on here to like really hammer into your mind that this is a more proggy album. Since Forever, heavier riffs, but you also get some like really dark melodies on top of the entire song. Banshee, this was maybe the doomiest song of their entire career, but it's also very melodic. But the big standout is the title track, Dead Again, and it's the longest song on their entire discography. 13 minutes of gorgeous melodies. It's got some doom to it. It's got a lot of those Iron Maiden gallops and just phenomenal riffs and leads all throughout. I mean, the album as a whole is fantastic. It just falls to last place just because I like the other albums more, but it could go up in the ranking in the future, but for now, it ranks as my number 7. So, after Dead Again came out, they would pretty much go right back to the studio at the end of the year, heading into 1999, as they just got back to work that quickly. And for this next album, they would get Cole Marshall to produce it, and also this would be kind of a return to their satanic and occult lyrics from the early days. And released May 15th, 1999, we get their final album to date, 9. And this is my number 6. So I think I put this one above Dead Again for the simple fact that it's heavier. Like, this is a heavier album. Maybe the heaviest album of their entire career, because the guitar tone on this album is just monstrous. And also, once again, similar to how Time was to In the Shadows, where it was more stripped down, this album certainly stripped down the songwriting and just got right into the nitty-gritty of riffs and heaviness. Last Rites, this song, as well as the song House on the Hill, both of them are just speed metal glory. Like, absolutely glorious songs in terms of, like, the more speed metal side to Mercyful Fate sound. The song Insane, I would say, is arguably the thrashiest song of their entire career, and there's even some riffs that kind of made me think of Metallica a little bit. But actually, the big standout was actually another one of the earliest songs I've ever heard from Mercyful Fate, Buried Alive. Now, funny enough, how I first heard it, remember back in the day when you could give your computer viruses with music downloading? It was like, I can't remember what program it was, but you had, like, people, like, misleading you with, like, oh, it's a Metallica and Megadeth song, and it was called Buried Alive. That's how I came across it. I didn't know it was Mercyful Fate. Keep in mind, I was, like, maybe 12 years old at the time, so I didn't know much. But looking back on it, it's a fantastic song. It's got some heavy, dark, evil riffs, and also one of the more creepy songs of the entire Mercyful Fate back catalog. Although, I will say the one thing that is odd about this album, the song The Grave has a little bit of, dare I say, an industrial feel, and it just didn't seem to fit this album at all to me. So, yeah, I kind of don't know what they were thinking about with that one, considering, you know, Mercyful Fate didn't hop on any trends, but yet that song sounded like they wanted to be like, hey, let's just do one industrial song, see what happens. Mixed results for me, but all the other songs are fantastic, and it's still, at its core, Mercyful Fate, and that's why it ended up as my number 6. So not long after 9 came out, the band would break up yet again, and basically King Diamond went on to continue with his solo band. However, between 2008 and 2011, you would get some reunion shows, primarily because, you know, around 2008 was when Metallica was making the Guitar Hero Metallica game, which, fantastic game, and they had the Mercyful Fate song Evil included in the game, as well as a live clip of King Diamond singing the Mercyful Fate medley with Metallica. So around that time, interest kind of came back, and so they would reunite for some one-off shows in 2008, as well as 2011, during the 30th anniversary shows Metallica were doing. They invited Mercyful Fate to join them for some of them shows, and they played some decent amount of shows in 2011. And the lineup for those reunion shows were King Diamond, Michael Diener, Hank Sherman, Timmy Hansen, and Bjorn T. Holm would all come together to do those reunion shows. And then after 2011, that was kaput, it seemed, for Mercyful Fate, until we fast forward to 2019. Mercyful Fate officially announced that they are reuniting, and at the time, the lineup was going to be King Diamond, Hank Sherman, Bjorn T. Holm, Mike Weed, and Timmy Hansen. Like, it was announced Timmy was going to be a part of the reunion and maybe a part of a possible 8th studio full-length. However, Timmy would unfortunately pass away not too long after the reunion was announced in 2019, I believe, due to cancer. And that was a pretty big hit for the metal world, considering Timmy, he was a founding member of both Mercyful Fate and the King Diamond solo band, and it was a hell of a bassist, and he is sorely missed. So in his place for the first 5 years of this new reunion would be bassist extraordinaire Joey Vera from Armored Saint and Fate's Warning. He would come in to play on bass, although in 2022, because he was splitting his time with Mercyful Fate as well as Armored Saint and Fate's Warning, bassist from England, Becky Baldwin, would fill in for Joey on bass from 2022 until this year, where Joey would leave Merciful Fate to focus primarily on Armored Saint and Fate's Warning, and Becky Baldwin would take over on bass and remains the bassist to this day. So the lineup we have currently: King Diamond, Hank Sherman, Bjorn T. Holm, Mike Weed, and Becky Baldwin. Now, of course, there's the rumors that they're going to record again and make another album. But then again, you also have the King Diamond solo album. The Institute's still supposed to happen, which at this point, who even knows if it's going to happen? We just have to wait and see. But overall, what is the legacy of Merciful Fate? Well, Merciful Fate's legacy is that they are rather a musician's band, because a lot of bands and musicians were heavily inspired by Merciful Fate back in the early 80s, primarily Metallica. Like, of course, as I talked about at the beginning, they did the medley of Merciful Fate songs in the late 90s, and you come and find out that they were huge fans of Merciful Fate. And then Megadeth, as well as other bands that came along in that thrash metal movement, and then of course black metal bands picked up on the imagery and decided to kind of run with it and take it even more extreme. And then death metal bands wanted to take their complex riff writing and apply it to their genre. And then classic heavy metal bands like to take a lot of their influence and run with it today. So Merciful Fate, arguably one of the top 15 greatest heavy metal bands of all time. Classics. King Diamond, you're the fucking man. Nothing more, nothing less can be said. But of course, the rankings are just my opinion. What did you guys think of this ranking? Let me know your ranking of Merciful Fate albums in the comments section below, as we're getting close to the end of the year and we got one more discography left to talk about. That'll be coming the week before Christmas. The next band is going to be Immortal. We're going to end off with some black metal, and it's going to be a good time. So be on the lookout for that. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. Keep your horns high and your dreams wet.
Thank you for your patronage.